Welcome to another episode of Ask 360, where we're answering all your questions related to health, fitness, pain, injury, and nutrition. Our question today comes from Adam, and Adam asks, I like to run, but I'm often getting injured, and I feel it's because I don't stretch enough. How important is stretching? Now, this is a fairly long-held belief, and is actually statistically the number one reason why people think they get injured. I think it comes from things that we're taught or made to believe when we're children. I'm not going to blame PE teachers for this completely, but it is something that is, I think, perpetuated by sports coaches and PE teachers. And there's this belief that if we don't stretch enough, either before exercise and after exercise, that increases our risk of injury. Now, what does stretching do? So stretching can increase both chronic and acute changes in range of motion. So if you stretch a muscle, then your range of motion directly after that will increase. If you do a certain amount of stretching over a certain period of time, then your range of motion, your chronic change in range of motion will also increase. However, on the whole, according to a number of different studies, stretching alone doesn't actually lead to a decrease in injury rates. So does this mean that stretching doesn't play a part in injury prevention? Not necessarily. If you have a limitation in range of motion that prevents you from moving in an optimal way to perform your particular activity, then increase in that range of motion is likely to benefit that activity and make you more efficient at performing that movement and therefore potentially less likely to get injured. However, this needs to be approached in a fairly detailed way. So we need to identify the demands of the movement or the activity that you want to do. You need to identify the movement capacity required, and then you need to train that capacity. And if that involves increasing your range of motion, then that's something that should be implemented. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that stretching is the best thing to increase range of motion. We can use assessments to analyse the effectiveness of different types of mobility and modalities. Try saying that 10 times in a row. And there may be other things such as self-massage, joint mobilization, and even specific strengthening type movements that can actually be more effective at improving range of motion and improving mobility. So an example is if you're performing an overhead press and you have a limited range of motion in your shoulder elevation, then stretching into that range or using some other type of modality to increase your range of motion may be effective in increasing that range and allowing you to perform that overhead press with better technique and therefore making it less likely to get injured. However, there are some activities such as sprinting and even jumping to a certain degree where we actually want that stiffness, and having restricted range of motion in certain areas can actually be advantageous. So does that mean you shouldn't stretch? Stretching can be great to do after an activity and sometimes before an activity, but in particular afterwards. Stretching can help in recovery, not so much from a physical perspective, but also from a neural perspective and even psychological perspective. So when we finish training, we want to try and settle what we call our autonomic nervous system down. So we're going from that flight or fight response to more of a calm, relaxed sort of everyday response. If we finish our training session and we walk out the door still in training mode, then that's going to affect the way that our body, our endocrine system, our neurological system is functioning for the rest of the day. So we want to try and restore some of that homeostasis. And stretching is a good way to do it because it's a very passive, ideally a very relaxed intervention, and is often combined with things like deep breathing, which again is very useful for recovery. So from that perspective, it can be really beneficial. Stretching beforehand, we have often talked about the dangers in terms of stretching before an activity. If you were to perform a very heavy lift or a maximal jumping movement or a sprint, you probably wouldn't want to do at least static stretching directly before that. However, if you find that static stretching, prolonged stretching helps you perform your activity, helps getting you into better positions, then if you start with some static stretching and then move on to more of a dynamic stretch and then some activation and do that as part of a warm-up, then it's probably fine. However, if you don't particularly enjoy stretching, if after a session you go to stretch and it just feels painful and it's just uncomfortable, then there's a lot of other ways that we can go about facilitating optimal recovery. So, going back to the original question, we know that targeted mobility interventions can be useful in potentially decreasing the risk of injury, but it needs to be very specific to that individual. What we can do to mitigate injury specifically, well, not specifically with running, with any activity, the two biggest things are load management. So, training errors are the most common cause of injury. So if you go from running 20 kilometers a week to 40 kilometers the next week, then that's a training error. That's excessive load. And so making sure that the way that we're performing our exercise, the way that we're loading our activity is appropriate and progressed appropriately, that's really the number one thing that we need to do for injury prevention or injury reduction. We can never prevent injuries, but we want to do our best to decrease the likelihood. And then the other thing, and this is very relevant for running, is resistance training. So we know that generalized resistance training for the lower limb will decrease the likelihood of lower limb injury. Now, understand that a lot of endurance athletes don't enjoy doing strength training or really enjoy doing anything else but endurance training. However, doing a small amount of strength training and 15, 20 minutes 2 or 3 times a week is sufficient to make a big difference to your training capacity, your load tolerance, and also your performance. So it's been shown that even taking out some of your running training and replacing that with resistance training can be really effective in improving your running performance. So that's basically our take on it. If you'd like any more information or you want to discuss a running related injury or even running performance, please feel free to come in and book a consultation, and we'll help you get on the road to better running performance and hopefully decrease the likelihood of future injury. Thanks very much, Adam, for your question, and thanks everyone for listening. If you do have questions, please feel free to submit them and we'll do our best to answer them on the show. We'll see you next time, guys. Thank you.